Well, thank you very much. And they've basically given me 10 minutes to summarize all of CETA and to solve all the problems that have been standing in the way of completion of the deal. But seriously, I'm obviously, in 10 minutes, I can only say so much. But basically, what I want to try to capture here is a linkage in my research between the trade deal and issues of federalism, subnational governance, and regional development. The first point, which you'll all be very familiar with, of course, is that this is supposed to be one of the most novel and far-reaching trade agreements that we've ever seen, certainly between developed states. And the focus was much more on the issues of the new economy, the global linkages, the supply chains, investment, intellectual property, issues of that sort. And so a number of these issues touched on provincial competence, and therefore one of the novel features of these negotiations is the involvement of the provinces at several of the negotiating tables and the direct representation in some parts of the talk of provincial interests. But despite these ambitions, we see that the high-profile issues that seem to be remaining on the table have very little to do with the new economy, and in fact address very traditional economic issues in primary sectors and issues that we might think are economically relatively marginal in today's economy, but obviously for political reasons are very prominent in the final stages of the talk. And this brings to mind, and just to link to our event here, that a couple of observations from interactions I had when I was here 2 or 3 years ago that at the beginning of my research on the CETA that are relevant. One of them was a business supporter of the agreement who was expressing optimism about the goals, but very concerned about the focus of this federal government on very particular local constituencies and policies that he saw as sort of not forward-looking, focusing more on the issues that we now hear about, such as beef, pork, dairy, energy sectors, extractive sectors, as opposed to new high-tech, intellectually property-driven sectors. And so he was pessimistic that this orientation might have eventually erode some of the energy for the deal. Well, he may have been, in a way, foresightful in the sense that a lot of the more difficult issues toward the end stage have been some of these traditional issues. And I remember also engaging with one of the ambassadors at the time from one of the northern European states who also expressed the idea that all he was hearing from the Canadian side was about some of the primary sector issues. That would seem to be the key focus. And so a lot, of course, has gone on behind the scenes in vast areas of the agreement, which we are not yet privy to, which, of course, affects our ability to analyze, have been signed off in some form. But the high-profile remaining issues tend to relate to this idea that politics is local. So from the point of view of the governments negotiating the deal, at the end of the day, you have to look out for those local particular interests. And I know that there are subnational and member state issues within the European Union which are important, but in 10 minutes, I will focus on the Canadian examples, some of which will be familiar to some of you and maybe new to others. But the nature of the Canadian economy is that you have a very widely divergent economy with an uneven balance of resource endowments and industrial development. And so different sectors of the economy are prominent in different parts of the country, and as a result have a very high political profile within particular provinces and territories of Canada. And so that applies to the primary sectors and also to some of the more advanced high-tech and industrial sectors. So I'll give you a brief tour of some of Canada's regions, given the amount of time we have, and just highlight some of the issues that have remained on the table, and we continue to hear about them today, not because they're critical overall to the agreement or even to the economy nowadays, but because they're politically important in particular regions of the country. So if we think about central Canada, for instance, some of the issues which have been problematic throughout the negotiations include things like concerns over the local promotion of green energy technologies, which have been controversial, automotive industry, and in particular instance that Canada has mostly co-production of American and Japanese, other Asian vehicles, and so issues of rules of origin for content of final products become a very important issue that have taken some time to address. Like many other provinces, the distribution by the public sector of alcohol, wines, and spirits, and limitations and labeling for certain products that might be important. In the case of Quebec, some of the more and I might observe in the Quebec case, for instance, that as a demonstration of the overall political will going forward, we did have a significant change of government in Quebec in the middle of the negotiations, and yet sort of a continuity of engagement. But difficult issues include, for instance, how to deal with the procurement for their massive public sector energy industry, and particularly important industries at the local level, including urban transport equipment, aerospace, and so forth. But again, one of the old sector issues becomes very important there because, of course, there's a large rural industry in the dairy sector that has been protected by supply management. And so this has become something, of course, that as the Europeans seek to gain greater access to the export market for cheese, poultry, other products, becomes an important issue. In the case of the Western provinces, to some degree, the most high-profile issue of the dirty energy from Alberta's oil sands seems to have been sidestepped or managed in a different direction, although one of the European participants at our panel yesterday was indicating that we might not have heard the last of it. But basically, at least at the official level, we hear that is being worked around. But, of course, more topical in the news recently, the issues of meat production, particularly beef quotas, and Europe's insistence, of course, on only importing non-hormone treated beef, and therefore the Canadian concern with how do we create a viable sector of non-hormone treated beef, and we need a certain quota to achieve this. So we have heard, of course, leaks of a potential compromise arrangement there. So obviously some of these hurdles are able to be addressed over time. But nonetheless, it's interesting in light of the predictions given by the lobbyist and the ambassador at the beginning of my research that these type of issues are the ones that remain very important toward the end. And I noticed a quote a couple weeks ago from an Alberta minister, whatever else is on the table in terms of CETA, that they would hold out as long as possible on the beef issue. So that's some of the, gives you an example of some of the political pressures that are being brought to bear on the federal government. In the Atlantic provinces, you see a divergence of views, but when I was doing research on the Nova Scotia case and talking to Nova Scotia government officials, I find again, what they talk about is seafood. Right? What they think is the high-profile thing they can sell about this deal is seafood. They have a whole range of investments in maritime technology, biomedicine, and so on. But that's the public face. That's what they put forward, and of course that reflects, again, the interest of the government in projecting itself in various rural constituencies in the province. And Newfoundland is always sort of a little bit contentious, has presented one of the complications, and of course the access of European processors to the raw materials of fish conflicts with a Newfoundland requirement for local domestic processing of fish. So we've seen this come up in very interesting ways. The Newfoundland Premier suggesting the Prime Minister had threatened to withhold loan guarantees for a massive hydroelectric project if the province did not give in on this, and more recently, the province essentially banning its own producers from exporting in a moment when local fish processors do not want to buy all their fish, but because they're concerned that it'll set a precedent for CETA if they allow exports now. Right? So these issues can be very complicating, and again, they seem to be on the surface fairly trivial and not economically significant, but nonetheless politically very important, as our colleague from the delegation said earlier. And then, of course, financial sector issues, and I know that there's been some pressure for opening Canadian financial services, and certain regulatory traditions in the Canadian context are different, and sometimes cited as one of the strengths of the Canadian economy and the face of global crisis, and of course the inability to integrate our securities regulations across the country as well. Just a couple of other general issues that affect provincial governance, and to some degree, at least some of these are being set aside. So the municipal concerns have been expressed by cities, but by and large the provinces have been willing to persist in addressing the issues of procurement and access to contracting and supplies, and cities who have objected to this on the basis of trying to promote local, either sustainable or simply economic self-promotion goals, have been generally had those concerns set aside by the provinces. But a more substantial issue of concern, of course, given the provincial responsibility for health care, is the issue of pharmaceutical imports and the protection of data from research pharmaceuticals. And a number of the provinces do have concern about the possible price increases and the effects on their healthcare systems. Anyway, there's a large number of issues for 10 minutes, so I'll try to go through some of the last points here just fairly quickly. And we're looking, of course, at constitutional implications and the nature of federalism, and my ultimate goal in the project will be to try to look at some of the comparative implications for an established federation like Canada and a transnational federal system like the European Union. But in the Canadian case, of course, one of the issues is Ottawa, as signatory to the agreement, having to basically accept responsibility for provincial deviations or violations of CETA agreement. So what's going on in that area is one area of research interest. But finally, I would just say that obviously what we're seeing here, and it's the first time the provinces have been involved at this level, it's one of the first times the European Union has negotiated certain areas of investment centrally. And what we see, of course, is that there's a learning curve in terms of how those processes get completed. So yesterday there was a lot of lamenting about how long the agreement was taking, but given the complexities of governance and the complexities of the economy and interprovincial differences, it shouldn't really be too surprising to us that these types of things have taken a long time to address, and the political will appears to be there, but of course there are also possibilities for changes at the provincial level politically, which could, of course, create some ongoing problems. So given our time, there's plenty of opportunity to discuss, hopefully, in question time, et cetera. But thank you very much.